And welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Marla DeVries, and I am the Director of Resource Development at the Greenhouse Project. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar and give you a few housekeeping details before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded, and you are in listen-only mode. There will be a time at the end for Anne to take your questions. So we encourage you throughout the presentation to either put your questions in the question box or in the chat box, and we'll be checking those regularly, and we will get those to Anne at the conclusion of her presentation. Also wanted to let you know that a survey and a recording of this presentation will be sent out via email within 24 hours of today's presentation. So I wanted to welcome you to our third webinar in our Best Life series, a focus on retained abilities. Our speaker today is Anne Ellett. She's a nurse practitioner and our dementia care specialist at the Greenhouse Project. She's also the author of the Greenhouse Best Life Approach to Supporting Persons Living with Dementia. And I know every time there's a presentation by Anne, I learn something new. And I get challenged a little bit. So looking forward to having Anne educate us and perhaps challenge us a bit. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Marla. Welcome, everyone. As Marla said, this is another webinar in this series of the Best Life approach. And thank you for joining us today. As many of you already know, the Best Life approach has been adopted by the Greenhouse homes to support their elders and residents who are living with dementia. And studies show that over 70% of people throughout nursing homes and assisted living communities across the country have cognitive changes. Almost every place today says we do memory care. But in reality, there's often very little training offered to the direct care team and very little innovation or change. The same things just keep getting repeated over and over. Well, the Greenhouse Project recognizes that providing the best environment and care for people living with dementia is very complex. It's not easy, and it's much more complex than just putting on your website, we do memory care. So the Best Life approach is an innovative way to support people living with dementia. An important component of Best Life is helping us become more aware as professionals and family members of our own biases and misperceptions about people living with dementia that limit the choices that we provide for them. Best Life has 4 core principles, which you see here on the screen: the power of normal, focus on retained abilities, dignity of risk, and advocacy. I've spoken about some of these on previous webinars. So today we're focusing on retained abilities. And as Marla said, I love to challenge people. I hope that today will stimulate you to think and maybe ask some questions. That's why we do these. So thank you again for joining us. So why is it important to focus on retained abilities and talents of people living with dementia? What does that really mean? Well, because there is the myth, the misperception that if a person has been diagnosed with dementia, they're incapable. We have all been trained to focus on their inabilities and losses. And I know as a nurse, that was, I had very little training on dementia care, but the training I did have was all about what they couldn't do, what their losses and inabilities were. So Kate Swaffer, who's a dementia activist living in Australia, says it very well. There are myths, including we are all end stage in our dementia. People with dementia cannot and do not lead good lives with dementia, and that we are unable to contribute in meaningful ways to our communities. It is wrong to continue to highlight the losses. So by only highlighting the losses, we don't acknowledge the strengths, the talents and their abilities to have real relationships and their abilities to be able to continue to contribute and have purpose. I think most of us on the call today, we're real familiar with the MDS system. And what is the MDS system? It's a very intricate, complicated system for documenting losses. So this is the focus of the care community throughout our country, is that we've been trained to focus on their inabilities. There's a stigma attached to dementia. People try to hide their diagnosis. And again, because of the myth that everyone with the diagnosis of dementia is incapable and unable, people look at them differently. They don't want to share their diagnosis because they think that people will look at them and go, oh, that person is now incapable of, and then the long list starts. So here's some interesting statistics. 50% of people living with dementia have experienced some type of abuse. That's an amazing statistic. It could be emotional, physical, financial, sexual. Very common for people living with dementia to experience some type of abuse. They're treated as if they're less than. How often do professionals talk over them as if they weren't even there? They talk about them and don't include them in conversation. How often is that memory care unit designed to be at the end of the hall? Way down there at the end of the hall. And often it's the last place in a building that gets that new carpet to be cleaned and renovated. It doesn't matter, they won't know the difference. I hear that from operators of places that do memory care. Yeah, we're gonna get to that, but we were not gonna do it this year. But the lobby of the building looks beautiful and has that gorgeous chandelier in it. So we segregate people living with dementia. We put them often in a locked unit at the back of a building, kept away from the other people. Why would we do that? I think we need to stop and ask ourselves, why is this the traditional approach that often the quote unquote dementia unit or the memory care unit is a locked unit, or it's at the back of the building where other people are not going to interact and see it? And people talk about their incapacities instead of their strengths. When I'm working around the country, I often will go and tour a nearby place that says they do memory care. It's not a place that I'm familiar with. If I have time, I'll just look them up and I'll just show up in the lobby and ask if I can have a tour. And as I'm touring around in the nursing home or the assisted living, I ask to be introduced to some of the residents. And often the introduction is something like, this is Bob. He doesn't do much anymore. He just likes to sit here all day. He used to be a teacher, but now he can't even read. So in my mind, I'm going, well, why would you introduce and identify someone by what they can no longer do? Why do people feel that that's a part of how they have to introduce or identify people living with dementia? Instead, the staff could introduce Bob to me and say, let me introduce you to Bob. He is the best singer, and when we have music, Bob always livens up the place. Or they could say, Bob has a great smile and always makes everyone feel welcome. So we can focus on what Bob is successful at right now, not on what his losses are. So I ask all of us to think about it. When we see a person who's been identified as living with dementia, is the first thing that comes to your mind maybe a list of things that person can no longer accomplish? Or do you focus on their retained abilities? So what is our viewpoint? Most of us, we do make snap judgments. We can look at someone and kind of quickly decide, oh, she's a smart person, she's in charge. Or we can look at someone and think, she has dementia, I guess she can't do much anymore. So how many times do we read as nurses or as professionals working in care environments, how often do we read the medical records on someone new who will be moving into your nursing home or memory care unit and quickly decide, usually without ever having met that person, oh, another dementia patient, they probably won't be able to do much. We'll sign them up for this and that. So we're making judgments without even getting to know the individual and know what their abilities and strengths are. Some of you may have heard the term excess disability. And with our biases and misperceptions, we could use the example of maintaining mobility, which is so important to the health and well-being of an older person. So many people start out walking or needing some assistance, but end up in wheelchairs, usually without any medical reason for the use of the wheelchairs. In fact, spending the majority of one's day in a wheelchair is only hastening their debility and dependence. Because remember, wheelchairs were never designed to be used as a seat for a long period of time. They were a mode of transporting a person from one location to another. But isn't it easier and quicker for us if we can just walk up behind someone and start moving them to where they want to be? So excess disability means a person is losing the ability to do something, not because of a physical or medical condition, but due to something else. So many older adults end up in a wheelchair because we encourage them to sit in a wheelchair rather than us take our time to assist them to walk or transfer them into a regular chair. So this is a common sight in many memory care programs. The majority of people sitting in wheelchairs. And again, by encouraging this, we're encouraging them to conform to our misperceptions of being unable, incapable. It doesn't really matter. They won't know the difference. So here's the new normal. No medical reason. They can't use their legs. It's more convenient for us. And those of you that have worked with me or heard me talk before, you know that I often will challenge a care team and I'll say, well, what percent of your elders, what percent of your residents spend the majority of their day in a wheelchair? And then what's the medical reason for it? And so I ask them to go around and we brainstorm on each individual resident. And often there's nothing in the medical record that says that person cannot put weight on their legs. It's only that they need more assistance and we need more time to do it. So this has become the common theme. And so I challenge us to not have this okay, that that we are helping to maintain their independence and recognizing how important it is. Our biases about people living with dementia often are, well, they don't need much. They're not going to know the difference. So if we keep them clean and safe, we've done our job. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not signing up for that. I want a lot more than being kept clean and safe. Many of you have seen statistics like this, the rates of depression of people living in nursing homes and other types of senior living. And in nursing homes, it's 50%, which is a pretty horrible statistic. But is it any wonder when the people living there have so few choices and there's minimal resources putting towards helping them be the best they can be? And if any of you that listened to previous webinars I did on the power of normal, creating a normal environment and the dignity of risk. So we allow them to have more choice and more normalcy in their environment. So again, Kate Swaffer, another great quote from her. She travels all over the world and is an advocate, and she herself is living with dementia. And she says, focus on our human right, not only to a diagnosis, but to rehabilitation and disability support to enable independence for longer. And I think that's, if we think about that for a moment, they're saying, and people are being diagnosed with dementia much earlier than previously. So there's a real strong advocacy group really across the world that are dialoguing together and to say it's our right, not just to be diagnosed correctly, but to be given the resources and the support to be able to live a good quality of life. So here's something to compare for a moment. And I'm old enough that I can remember back 30, 40 years ago when people who were born with Down syndrome, the families were encouraged to put them in institutions. They were never considered quote unquote normal. Your child's not going to have the ability to develop and take care of themselves. You should put them in a care institution. Horrible things. A horrible way to look at someone. Because today, through advocacy, the medical professionals have come to recognize that a person with Down syndrome can benefit from an individual assessment and care plan and connection with rehabilitative and social resources in a care plan that follows their needs for the rest of their life. In contrast, a person diagnosed with dementia is usually told to get their affairs in order and come back in 6 months to see the doctor. It's treated as a hopeless diagnosis, almost as a death sentence. The people, the advocates who are living with dementia, when they talk about their experiences of what it was like when they received their diagnosis from their doctors, it is really very profound, because most of them are just given the diagnosis and no hope, no connections, and it was a very, very difficult time in their lives. So we know, thank goodness, that people with Down syndrome have great potentials, have abilities, and we can work to support each of them as an individual to have as much independence as possible. So what if we considered dementia a syndrome instead of a disease? Would we treat people differently? Maybe they would leave the doctor's office with information to rehabilitation and occupational therapy to maximize their abilities. Maybe they could leave the doctor's office with information on dementia-friendly cafes where they can socialize with other people living with dementia. Could they leave the doctor's office with a referral to a support group so they could express their feelings about the diagnosis? Currently, we offer none of those things, but rather it's up to each person and their family members to search for resources themselves, often when they're feeling overwhelmed. So I call it using the buttering the toast as an example of excess disability. So often we just do, whether it's complex or things that we consider everyday simple tasks, so often we do them for once a person is diagnosed with dementia. And these were important kind of landmarks that show how we perceive people. Oh, this person has dementia, so therefore they must not be able to, and then fill in the blank. Butter the toast, dress themselves, know whether they want to go outside or inside, be able to tell you what they want and what they don't like. So we assume things about people and often take their independence away by not focusing on their abilities. Often people living with dementia are handed children's toys to distract them. Why would we do that? We don't believe in retrogenesis, which is the idea that adults can reverse age and become children. A person living with dementia will never be a child again. They're adults. They're capable of exploring, using things, problem solving, and having real relationships. They deserve to be treated as adults. So I don't know where all of you are currently working that are on this webinar, but I ask you when you go back to work after this to just have eyes wide open and look around. Are there things that are not dignified? Are the elders or the residents where you work being treated as less than adults? Because if we see them and treat them as children, we are focusing on their inabilities, and we can't view them as whole adults with retained abilities and talents. So here's two different images. One woman is holding a doll. I see that a lot. I see baby doll programs, and I know that baby dolls are offered to people living with dementia. They think it's out of compassion. They think it allows the resident to feel like they can nurture or care for something, but it's not normal. If you were able to attend the webinar on the power of normal, we talked about creating normalcy for people. And for an older adult, it's not normal. It's not usual for her to be holding a doll unless she has a history of being a doll collector, or maybe playing with a grandchild or something like that. So that's not a normal view of an older adult. But the photo of the woman with the infant is dignified. It enhances her image. There's nothing in this photo that would identify her as living with dementia or being unable or incapable. And the photo of the woman on the right is she's an elder from a home in greenhouse home in Arkansas, and that's a nurse's infant. And Jan, the woman who is not very responsive, very verbal usually, when she held that infant, she immediately cradled that infant and began to rock it and sing to it. So look at the abilities that she still retains, that she can still reference, versus the picture of the woman with the doll, where you're going, this isn't usual. What's going on here? And perhaps it identifies her as by her losses and inabilities instead of by her retained talents. So we're looking for experiences that are age appropriate and enhance their image. We want to enhance their abilities, not highlight their losses. And when I do best life training, and we have a whole pretty detailed section on meaningful engagements, and often people will go, well, we don't have the money or the staff to do things like this. So I'm always aware that budgets are tight and people don't have a lot of extra resources and money. So the kinds of things that I talk about when I talk about meaningful engagements and enhancing their image, I don't talk about things that you need to go out and spend a lot of money on. There's a lot of resources available and a lot of things that each of us can do in our own work environments for the residents. And often it just starts with us being aware of our misperceptions of how we are viewing a person living with dementia. So this is a interesting story of an elder. She lives in a greenhouse home in Phoenix, Arizona, Lifestream. And she used to own and work in her own restaurant. So when the care team was washing the dishes, she wanted to participate. This was her normal daily experience. She had confidence working in the kitchen. And by us continuing to encourage her to help in the kitchen, a more normal environment was created for her, and it showed her retained abilities. a kind of an interesting aside is that her daughter came in and said, well, you know, we're paying for my mom to be taken care of here. Why are you having her wash the dishes? And so we also worked with the family member and said, you know, we can understand why you might say that, but let us tell you what we think it's bringing and enabling her to do. And the daughter had a complete change of view and said, oh, I understand. So it wasn't that we were making her do her dishes. It was that we were allowing her to be successful, and we were looking at her retained abilities. So it's kind of like buttering the toast. She liked to, felt good washing dishes, and she was given that opportunity. I think it's really nice. So again, as Kate Swaffer said, we want to focus on our human right to rehabilitation and disability support to enable independence for longer. So what are the opportunities that you can provide in your workplace that are going to be meaningful for your residents and help maintain their independence? So this is a variation of a quote from my friend Marla DeVries, and I say it as, dignity is taken away one small action at a time, and we can put it back one small decision at a time. So what can we do when we are working with people living with dementia to partner with them and to focus on their talents and abilities? So I hope you've thought of some questions. One thing that I always like to do when people attend any Best Life training is I always like to ask them, what will you do different? So I ask you to think of that. And again, I thank you for joining us, and we're available if there's questions.
All right, thank you, Anne. So I want to encourage folks, we've got some time, so go ahead and put your question either in the question box or in the chat box, and I will be monitoring those. There is one question that came up already, and so Anne, I think you have an answer for this. So this question is, have you ever heard of programs that use dance for adults with dementia?
Sure. Yeah, dance can be a real powerful opportunity, I think, for people living with dementia. I love it because it involves movement, and anything that stimulates really any of us, but certainly older adults and people living with dementia to be mobile or to move. And the other thing about dance programs, if they're, I'm sure that if the approach is done right, there's no right or wrong way to dance, and so everyone can be successful at it. So I love those. Any of us that you go out to the dance floor and you see some really beautiful, graceful dancers, and then there might be someone like me that's maybe not so graceful, but I still enjoy dancing. And so the important thing is that you're stimulating them to respond to music, to move in ways that are comfortable and fun for them. So yes, I very much like dance programs.
So another question came in regarding, and I'll paraphrase here, but kind of our knee-jerk reaction to safety or toward safety when we think about giving elders living with dementia more opportunities. So can you talk about how we can maybe squelch our own knee-jerk reaction or immediate response to thinking safety first?
Yeah, and that is a tough one. Again, we've all been trained to focus on inabilities and losses, and we've also all been trained that we never want any bad outcomes. So you know, and of course falls are the big one, but it could be elders leaving out the front door, and that's, you know, not usually makes people really crazy and nervous. And so there's lots of safety issues, and most care communities, they spend a significant amount of money on risk management and making sure that there are not bad outcomes. So I challenge us, and of course from the start, we would all agree that we never want a bad outcome. We would never want any resident or elder to have any to suffer in any way or any injury. But I also challenge all of us to think about what is the usual day where you work, and is that a type of day or a quality of day that would be acceptable to you if you were living there? And if it's not, then I challenge us to say, well, that's also a bad outcome. So if your residents are in a somewhat confining space all day, if your elders and residents don't have choices to engage in things that are meaningful to them, that's also a bad outcome. So instead of just counting the number of falls or the number of hospitalizations, how about looking at what the quality of their day is and say, are we giving them the best day possible, allowing them to have the choice and independence? So it's one thing being willing to ask ourselves that question and say, okay, do I really feel like this is the best environment? This is an environment that I would be willing to live in and experience myself. If not, then that's not a good outcome. I recognize that that doesn't immediately give us confidence or ease of mind to say, okay, we're going to open all the doors. Okay, we're going to let everyone start walking around all the time now. But it means having that conversation, being able to recognize it, that knee-jerk need for quote unquote safety often drives limiting choices and experiences that are offered to people living with dementia. So having that discussion as a team, having that discussion with your leaders and say, you know, why do we keep them all confined in this one area? How can we begin to increase their types of experiences? How can we begin to open the doors for certain hours of the day and just let people start to flow in and out a little bit more? Why do we keep them segregated behind a locked door if you're working in a large community? So if you do attend Best Life trainings, these are questions we dig into pretty deeply. And I think the first step is being willing to ask those questions and start having those discussions as a team. Because again, I can remember back to the day when it was acceptable to tie people in bed, saying it was for their their safety and their well-being that we restrained them and tied them in bed. Well, thank goodness people started asking questions about that and said there has to be a better way. So I think that's just a question we all need to keep asking ourselves. What's the next thing we can do to make it a better way?
Well, Ann, and you sparked a thought, and there's a couple more questions, but I want to tie this in because I know a lot of what you talk about in Best Life talks about that we have to shift our own mindset. And I remember years and years ago, I was in a class with a nurse, and he talked about he had such a heart for caring for elders, and that he thought it was his job that, you know, if he could almost, and he would visualize, you know, picking up an elder and moving her from her bed and never having her feet touch the ground, you know, that's kind of how he viewed the best that he could offer as a nurse. And so as we talked about person-centered care and person-directed care, he came to that conclusion that really what he was doing was limiting that elder. And so he had to shift his own perception about what it meant to truly care. And truly caring for someone may not be buttering the toast, as you say. It's giving them opportunity. And that's what care can look like in this new way of thinking. So,
yeah, great example. Yeah.
So a couple more questions. So suggestions that you have for impacting written care plans that, as you acknowledge, are by nature problem focused. So how can we integrate a focus on retained abilities in a care plan?
Yeah, great question. So I think you can integrate focusing on abilities and strengths by integrating things into the care plan, like Bob is very social, and it's meaningful for Bob to interact with people of on a social basis, or people of other generations. So you can identify things that are meaningful and put them into the care plan instead of always identifying what Bob can't do anymore. So think about, again, that when you develop a care plan, saying, okay, if we were to think about this resident, what are their retained strengths and talents and abilities? And let's be sure we care plan for those, so those happen and are recognized. And an example I have of that is Karen Love, who works with the Dementia Action Alliance and is so knowledgeable. And her background comes from engagement and activity development. And when she was visiting a lady who was living in a memory care area, and again, this lady was introduced to Karen as she doesn't do anything anymore. She just sits there all day. So Karen, who always carries a bag of tricks with her and has wonderful things that she pulls out, sat quietly next to this woman, and without knowing anything about the woman's background or history, just began to pull different things out of her bag. And at one point, she pulled out some different scraps of fabric and yarn and stuff like this. And this woman, who was not seemingly very engaged or responsive, began to hold the fabric, feel it, touch the seams, turn it over, fold it. And so she was very engaged with these different textiles that Karen had samples of. And later Karen found out this woman had been a master seamstress, a master tailor. And so how different would it be if this woman had been introduced to Karen as, you know, Mary is a master tailor and really knows so much about different kinds of fabrics. Why couldn't this resident be introduced in that way instead of identifying by what she's no longer able to do? So I think it's, again, it starts with our mindset and how we're viewing the resident.
Great. Another question, wanted your opinion on integrating different levels of cognition and when certain elders have quote unquote behavioral challenges mixed in with higher functioning persons.
Yeah, this is the question that everyone, all of us are asking, because as we begin to look at these segregated confining units, memory care units, and saying, is there a better way to do it? Everyone is asking this question, and it's a great question. If, for one thing, I like to remind us that if you're in an assisted living or a nursing home, the majority of people who live there will have cognitive changes. They might not have the dementia or Alzheimer's diagnosis on their medical chart, but often they're there because they forgot to take their medicines or they got lost driving. So the majority of people living in senior care environments have cognitive changes. So the idea that we're going to segregate them is pretty artificial. And to say, well, you can live in this area, but if you progress, now you're going to live back in this area. It's a little artificial. The new thinking, and it's one that I'm certainly comfortable with, is we don't identify people by stages, because you've probably heard the phrase, if you've met one person living with Alzheimer's disease, you've met one person living with Alzheimer's disease. All of us are so individual. And I certainly have met so many people who are labeled as end stage or moderate, and they still have so many abilities, and some of them have great verbal abilities. And so by labeling them and putting them in here or there, I think it's not a labeling that is backed up by science anymore. How a person progresses with dementia is going to be very individual. So again, if we focus on the individual, if we can identify what's meaningful and what they can be successful at, then you can create perhaps opportunities or maybe group engagements where you can invite people to participate, but they're not necessarily expected to participate because they have been given a label of being early, moderate, late stage. We're going to have an engagement about travel, and it's going to include maybe looking at some maps and maybe sampling some foods and maybe playing a little bit of music from Italy. Anyone who wants to attend can attend, and people will interact and take different things from that engagement as their abilities allow them. So that's the way I very much am supportive of integration and not segregating. The behavioral challenges, we talk about people having actions that are really communication and trying to let you know what their unmet needs are. So we try not to use the word behavior or aggression or exit seeking, things like this, because that's really describing it from our point of view. It's not giving any status, any credibility to what the person's point of view is who's experiencing it. It's what we're observing. He's exit seeking. Well, could that perhaps be a normal reaction to being in a confined space? Is it a reaction that I might have or you might have if we were in a confined space? Because that's not normal for us. So instead of labeling the person's actions as behaviors, maybe as a team we could start to say, what would it look like if certain hours of the day that door was propped open and Bob could maybe go out and explore other areas of the community? So again, it's changing our mindset and the way we allocate our resources.
And I see one final question, unless you prompted more thoughts from people, and there's still a few minutes left, so I want to encourage, if you've got a question that you haven't yet put in the question box, feel free to do that. So this is a follow-up question to the use of dance programs, and it's, do you have suggestions on generating metrics that would support dance programs? And I would maybe expand that, to other creative approaches for meaningful engagement for elders living with dementia.
Oh, I love that. Well, whoever is asking about the dance programs, that sounds like a best practice. I love it. And the fact that they want to measure something is even more exciting. So one of the metrics that I like to look at, it's a very simple metric when we do best life training, is how many times a day are your elders, are your residents physically active? And so that's one thing that I think would be pretty easy to measure, is how many people are being active, physically active during a dance program. And maybe they are not walking or standing on their feet, but maybe they're using their arms and their bodies and they're swaying. Maybe they can be enticed with some support to get on their feet. So, I mean, I think we know there are so many benefits, both physically, emotionally, and also even cognitively, of increasing the circulation to the brain. So if you could measure the number of minutes that people are involved in a physical activity, whether it's lawn bowling or dancing or gardening, I mean, I think these are all great measures to get. I also, one of the measures that we look at in Best Life is what % of your residents are in wheelchairs all day, spend the majority of their day in wheelchairs. So again, it's like taking a bite out of the elephant. You're not going to get everyone out of wheelchairs today or this week, but if you start thinking about, okay, we're going to move everyone out of wheelchairs into a regular chair for all meals, or for if they go outside on the patio, or if they want to join the cooking club or the travel club, we're going to put everyone in a regular chair for these. We're going to assist them to stand up, be weight bearing, even if they only transfer to another chair. You've given them such a gift by that moment. So these are great measures also to start collecting on what % of your residents spend the majority of their day in a wheelchair, and then measure it again in a couple months and see if you've made a change there.
Great. Another one came in related to spiritual wellness programs. So the question is, what about spiritual wellness programs, reading stories, listening to spiritual types of music? Thoughts on that?
Well, again, I would certainly support that as long as it's meaningful for the elders. I'm not a proponent of any large group activity where people are just kind of wheeled or led down the hall to attend it. So it comes from, especially I think spirituality is such really an intimate and personal expression. So I'd want to know what was meaningful to that person before I was reading from the Bible or having them attend a visitor pastor or somebody. All of these things are great, though, if it's meaningful to the person. So yeah, I'm very much in support of that, as long as it's meaningful.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating in the webinar, and most especially for Anne for continuing to challenge us and to remind us that really, I think the first change that needs to happen is the change within ourselves and what we think and what we believe, and then look at what are the actions that can be taken. I want to spend just a minute giving you a heads up of some opportunities that are happening in the Greenhouse Project community. So first of all, we have a workshop coming up on June 26th from 10 to 4 in the Detroit area. So the Greenhouse Workshop is a one-day opportunity to have the opportunity to go into a greenhouse environment, to hear about the greenhouse model and how it can be applied and how the core values come alive. This one in June is going to be at the Tome Rivertown neighborhood, and it will highlight the integration of the PACE program with the greenhouse model. So if you are interested, reach out to us and we will get you registered for that. There's no cost for that one-day workshop. Next webinar coming up in our Greenhouse 2.0 webinar series on cultural transformation is the case of Sarah Newman. So come hear from the leaders at Sarah Newman how they were able to make a deep, sustainable change, doing a significant renovation in their existing legacy environment, but also how they changed hearts and minds and not just the architecture. We also have coming up in October a two-day workshop at John Knox Village in Pompano Beach. So the first day, again, gives you that overview of the greenhouse model and a tour of the greenhouse homes at John Knox Village, the Woodlands. And day two is a deeper dive, looking at how do you take this philosophy and how do you now put your plan together. So if you are interested in attending and being in lovely Florida in October, again, please reach out to us. And finally, don't forget to follow us on social media. You see the various channels that we have. We'd love to stay connected with you, so look for those different opportunities. So thank you, Anne, and thank you, everyone, for being a part of this webinar, and we look forward to having you on another one soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.